let me ask my distinguished panelists just to introduce themselves quickly. Heike, please.
Sure, many thanks. So I'm Heike Hambert, I'm the Regional Director for the EBRD, responsible for the Eastern Mediterranean, so Jordan, Palestine and Lebanon. I used to introduce myself as the new kid on the block, but I feel like after being 5 years here in Jordan, I feel really as being a bit part of the fabric of the financial institution sector. EBRD has invested over €1 billion in Jordan over the last 5 years, 80% in the private sector. I think we are very keen proponents of public-private partnership, working with the government, but also working with a lot of you in the banking and financial institutions sector. So I think our journey has taken us in Jordan through, really the green revolution on solar and wind energy, but also supporting small and medium enterprise and trying to add capital to the general capital structure in the country. And now we're trying to take, this experience to Palestine and Lebanon, but today we're here in Jordan, and it's very key to see how we can play a role in revitalizing the economy, as the panel title indicates.
Thank you. Just to let you just a little supplementary question. It's like a feeder, but what's next for the EBRD in Jordan? I know that obviously I've mentioned it, but why don't you just tell us a little bit about what's coming up in May, and perhaps more importantly, what the future looks like for you here as an institution?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for giving me the chance to a bit of self-promotion. So the EBRD is having, for the very first time in its history, our global annual meeting in the Middle East, and it will take place in Jordan between the 8th and 10th of May. I'm sure a number of you have already signed up, and we'll make sure that invitations will go out to all of you. This is a moment where all our 69 shareholders come together and decide the sort of institutional strategic future of the bank, but also it's a big business investment forum with between 2,000 and 3,000 businesses from our 68 countries where our shareholders come from. So it's a great opportunity, 8th to 10th of May. Please, I want to see as many of you as possible. And for us, the future in Jordan, I think the future in Jordan is going to be very much focused on supporting key critical infrastructure investments with PPPs. I think we've done not the easy ones in the solar wind, but I think the next ones will be challenging. So we're looking at big infrastructure projects like the Red Debt, like the water sector, public-private partnerships in urban transport. We're going to see, hopefully, public-private partnerships with the hospital, education sector, schools. So I think it's going to be more challenging to bring this concept of private sector investments to public service delivery to Jordan, but I think we're ready for it. And I think we will also trying to find growth-enhancing investments across a number of industries, service sector, small and medium enterprise and manufacturing. But I think the key challenge and future for EBRD is really helping, supporting public-private partnerships in the next phase of the journey to get more private sector investments in key delivery.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the panel. Christos, please.
Yes, my name is Christos Christopoulos.
You need to have it again, put that close.
I'm very glad
to
be here. I will take the title of newest kid on the block for high because I've been here for 5 or 6 months. I'm based in Beirut. My official title is lead economist for Mashreq in Iran. We are based in Beirut, as I said. We have a regional office there. I typically work on analytical pieces, and I also work on policy loans, adjustment loans. I think the big part, the reason that I'm interested in working in Jordan is really to help bring around, support the government, support the private sector, bring around this transformation in the economy that is highly sought. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure known to many of you, but Radwan, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do. It doesn't seem to be on. Maybe try the other one.
Okay. This is called diversification, risk diversification. My name is Radwan Shaban. I'm Chief Economist of Arab Bank. I will tell you about Arab. I'm tempted to tell you about Arab Bank, but I think many of you
I
mostly
think they probably know about Arabic.
But in terms of my own work, I focus primarily on Jordan, but also on the countries of the region in which Arab Bank is participating, as well as on global economic issues, with a focus on macro. Prior to joining Arab Bank, I worked for many years at the World Bank and in different parts of the world.
Thank you. Your experience is invaluable. And last but by no means least, Hala. Again, we're all well-known figures, but you are all known. But Hala, a fellow moderator, she's already been teaching me how to do things, and I've learned. Seriously, so thank you, and tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
So I'm Hala Zawati. I'm the CEO of Jordan Strategy Forum, and I am so happy to see many of the members of Jordan Strategy Forum today among us. The forum is a think tank which is focused on economic policies and strategies. What we do is what most think tanks do, and we have a very strong research arm at the forum, and we tackle several economic issues that we believe will help us achieve or get to our vision of a strong, competitive economy here in Jordan. And as private sector, we believe we have a mission to help and to put our hand together with the government in order to achieve that goal. We do it via research, via availing a platform for dialogue between public and private sector, and via spreading awareness on several economic issues here in Jordan.
Thank you very much. Christos, as the new kid on the block, I'm going to start with you, throw you in to the metaphorical deep end. I want to do this particularly because I want to hear as I say, you're new, you have a view that may be different from the others. So, this panel is called Revitalising Jordan's Growth. What do you see as the major, I'm trying to find the right word, barriers, inhibitors, things that are dragging on Jordan's ability to grow at the levels that the finance minister said earlier this morning, about 5%-ish. What is the World Bank? What do you see as the sort of things that are holding that back?
I think
Again, you need to just that's it. Just
make this adjustment.
yeah, exactly.
I want to start from two or three speakers, the Minister of Finance spoke, and the Governor, and the CEO of Arab Bank. They spoke about a high period of economic growth. They said that Jordan is a lower growth period now. I think that one has to put this in context. And the context has been that up until now, Jordan has benefited from significant foreign inflows, from ability to export to Syria, to Iraq, to the Gulf, and from an ability to receive remittances. Now, for me, the period since 2009 has really shown a different potential GDP, I would say. The issue is that the Jordanian economy in the past was structured towards supporting those areas. It was structured to supporting exports to Iraq, structured to supporting exports to Syria, structured to support the service sector that was developed for remittances. Now, going forward, I think we have two choices. Either we wait for a new demand boom to come from outside, which I think is necessary for Jordan, but we can't just do that. I think we need to help adjust the structure of the economy a little bit to let it respond to different things. So, for example, to develop export markets. Of course, export markets not only in the region, but outside of the region, to develop the services sectors, to allow the financial sector to go into new areas of the economy. So, for example, we spoke about the banking sector. You raised the issue with the governor of the risk capital, the issue of meeting the needs of medium and smaller sized enterprises. So, in order to engineer this shift to an economy that is a bit more resilient to the fluctuations of the region, which are very real, I think we need to make a move to a bit more flexible markets, I would say, and I'm happy to discuss that later on. And and number one, and number two, to allow to allow labor, to allow our investments to flow into new sectors. So let me stop with that, and I'm happy to come back if you have a follow-up.
If I can try and summarize, I mean, it's a very succinct view, but is what you're saying that Jordan needs to focus more on doing things inside Jordan than being to reduce its vulnerability to I'm only talking about economics, there's no political stuff. It's horrible, but it's there, and that's not the subject of this conversation. But if what you're saying is, trade with Syria, trade with Iraq, remittances. Now, one could argue that Iraq can come back, Syria, we would hope, will come back, all of us. But remittances, I think structurally, that game, that market is going to, it will decline. So are you saying really that Jordan needs to look more to itself rather than to its region and to its markets?
Yes, I'm saying two things. One is for Jordan to look more into, so let me just take a step back.
Sure.
I will summarize in two things. I'll say Jordan should look more into itself, and it should also develop other markets, other export markets. But why am I saying that, and why do I think Jordan should look into itself? One measure of an economy's performance is its productivity. So many observers have said that since about 2009, 2010, productivity growth has stalled. So the question is that no matter what the social stress that Jordan is going through now, no matter what the contribution of supporting refugees, no matter what the difficulty Jordan is facing in accessing its older export markets, productivity is something that needs to be looked at and needs to be improved. So how do you, and improved productivity, better productivity is what will allow the country to be more competitive in the old markets, because even in the old markets, even in Iraq, what was mentioned today was that the terrain is changing. There are new actors coming in, so Jordan still needs to remain competitive there. So productivity gains are important for the old markets, but also for new markets. Now, how to get productivity gains? So this is usually it's a complicated topic among economists, but my way of seeing it very simply is that it's about reducing costs and finding efficiencies. So reducing costs in how we do business. So the governor, for example, spoke about using new technologies to reduce costs in the financial sector, reducing the costs of regulation, reducing some of the costs to employment. So it is about cost reduction. So I am saying that there's room for making efficiencies in the domestic economy. And this will not only allow for some additional demand to be generated, but it will allow for the economy to find new ground to orient itself. Okay?
Okay, yep, that's very clear. Radwan, as our other economist, I would like you to respond, amplify, and give us your thoughts on the same question about the sort of future economic outlook from a structural point of view. What are the barriers? What are the opportunities?
Well, I think Christos has covered the challenges and the barriers quite well. The way I would look at it is Jordan is a small open economy. It's a $40 billion economy. It has managed to have inefficiencies go on for a while, and I think some of those are the internal and structural reforms that are needed, that Chris was talking about. But I think also what in a sense, what has helped Jordan is the same forces that has hurt Jordan, which is the openness and the smallness. I think this has helped Jordan with very high growth rates in the last decade, and since then, since 2009, we've seen much lower growth rates because one external shock has come after another. Sitting where we are, clearly the internal reforms are extremely important, But at the same time, I think we need to build resilience of growth. A point which actually you talked about, Richard, in the morning. And I think the resilience in growth is something that will give us higher growth rates. So what we actually need is more diversified export base, more diversified growth base. And for a small open economy, that's really the way to both move to a higher growth rate and at the same time to have a resilient growth. Again, we can come back to detail, but basically the World Bank has done a study on diversifying the product space. I mean, some products in terms of agricultural goods and other goods that in terms of how can you get higher value added on the export side. And at the same time, the Jordan Strategy Forum has done a fantastic study on the product space. But I think increased diversification on the products is really an important element. And I think it needs to be complemented by increased diversification on the export demand side and the geographic demand. And here, let's just look very quickly at the structure of trade of Jordan. In 2017, a quarter of our exports went to the US. About a similar amount went to the GCC. Iraq had taken a much lower fraction. And then we have the rest of the Arab countries. We have Asia, Indonesia, India, and so on.
What about Europe? Was Europe involved?
Well, it depends on. Europe was extremely small.
Right.
Okay. I mean, basically, Europe actually is the missing big elephant in the room. It is big and it is important, and I think that's an important element. Basically, exports to Europe amounted to about 120 million JT, which is, I think, in terms of percent of GDP or percent of exports.
You can't even see it in the number.
It's not even clear what
if there was a chart, it wouldn't be there.
It's really small, is the point. And I think that's an important side. But also at the same time, let me just go back. So that's important and that needs to be followed. But I want to go back to, let's say, the market of Iraq and the GCC. And actually, it's really interesting because if we look at the export to Iraq last year, in the first 8 months before the border was reopened, it was flat, basically year on year. It grew by 1%. If we look at the last 4 months, it grew by 26%. This is substantial change. Still, it's way below the potential and below what we used to have in 2013. So hence, to be able to move goods, the trucks, more easily, to tackle the custom tariff, these are important issues. But nonetheless, I think in 2018 we are going to see higher export to Iraq after the reopening. But hopefully with these issues being tackled, we will see more of that. Then there is the GCC. Exports to the GCC dropped by 15% over the past 2 years. So in 2017, they were about 15% less than they were before. I have to say, I mean, last year imports of a country like Saudi Arabia have generally fallen.
Yeah.
So it's not something specific to Jordan, it's an across the board issue. So as we see an economic recovery in the GCC, I mean, that's something that will help Jordan as well. And then there is the EU,
Well,
which is
you-
a huge,
I love the way
huge elephant in the room.
you say, well, I love the way you say as we see, if we see in the GCC. I think some countries, I think UAE, possibly Qatar are okay, but I think Saudi should be better this year, but longer term, you know, we have to keep an eye on. Good points all. Hala, I'm going to come to you because Radwan name-checked your study, so please comment on what the other two said, but also tell us a little bit about that if you feel it to be relevant.
I just wanted to comment when he said the small market or the small amount of exports to Europe, so that everyone knows how small it is compared to our exports. It's good to know that all of our exports to Europe are the same amount as our exports to Qatar, or maybe as our exports to Palestine, which is a restricted market also for Jordan. So that's how small is our exports to the EU. In addition, when you look at the trade balance between Jordan and the EU, so 120 million JDs of exports, in return there is around 3.2 billion in imports. So there is a huge trade balance when it comes to Europe, not because it's a small market, but because we haven't reached that market the way we want to and the way we should do as
Oh,
Jordan.
and post-Brexit, of course, you'll have the wonderful United Kingdom to negotiate a bespoke deal with. Revolutionise both countries, I'm sure. But I'd like just to pick up, because I'm sure many of you know all of this, but I always think it is good to just sort of touch on these points. Radwan was saying that you've done this survey, this report on product as well. And I think, exports, any form of sales and marketing is dependent on two things. It's dependent on the market, and it's depending on what Christos said, which is the ability to produce whatever that market wants at in a competitive way. Competitive either from a quality perspective or a price perspective. Where can Jordan be competitive in exports that it isn't already being, or isn't already being at scale? What can this country produce that people want to buy internationally, assuming the trade barriers are lowered?
Well, the answer is a lot. In 2 words, if the A is a word.
A is definitely.
We have done this big study at the Jordan Strategy Forum. It actually took us a year, and it was built on a theory by Harvard and MIT. It's called the Economic Complexity Theory. And they provided a very nice tool which they call the product space, which is products in the space, and it gives you a good idea about what a country is good at producing and what is it not producing and they can actually produce. But the most important thing is that it's not anything that you can export would add the same to the economy of a country. And here we introduce something new, which is called the sophistication of the products, the sophistication of the goods that Jordan or any other country is exporting. And the idea is the more sophisticated are the products, the more the knowledge is requested to be put to produce these products, the better for the economy of the country, the more GDP per capita, the more prosperity of the country, because you will be able to generate job opportunities that will pay back for those people who are working in these jobs. Now, we identified the 20 broad sectors, and in each sector, and all of you can refer to our studies, and in each sector there are products, and we name the product by product, that are very, Jordan has a relative comparative advantage in exporting, and there are so many products that we do not produce, but we have the productive knowledge to produce them, and we also show the markets for these products. So I refrain from saying that sector X or sector Y is better than the other, because each sector has certain sophisticated products that Jordan can produce and export. But there are, of course, and this is worldwide, more sectors that have more sophistication, such as machinery, instruments, the chemical sector, and so on. But we've done that study, and everyone can have access to it. But before we continue, Richard, we will be tackling so many issues that relate to the Jordanian economy, and I'm sure we will be pinpointing some of the flaws, or maybe some of the constraints, or where did we go wrong as Jordan. But it's very important always to put things into context. It's very important before we say anything that to show that Jordan is a special country, and its economy is affected a lot by all the geopolitical, economic, the socio-economical issues that are happening around us. And we are blessed to be where we are now. Whatever we're going to criticize and whatever flaws we see in our economy, it's only because we want to propose to make it better, because we wanted to get there.
Well, I mean, I hope that you don't feel, and I hope no one here feels that we're here to be critical. Far from it. You know, we appreciate, and I think I was at pains to point out, and the minister himself said that, you know, it's when you get up from the first thing hitting you, something else hits you from the other side. You know, life is tough. You live in a difficult neighbourhood. That's not your fault. And the fact that the country has managed to survive and is still, you know, we all sort of feel that things are tough. They are tough, but you're still growing, which is a remarkable testament to many countries around you who can't do that. So I think it's beholden on us as foreigners who come in not to try and pick holes or tear things down, but to be positive and forward-looking. Just to go back to this sectors thing, just for my own, I mean, I know you have to share it with the audience, but for my interest, when you did this study, which I apologise for not having read from cover to cover, what surprising sectors, products came out of it? I mean, you know, we know tourism, we know culture, we know agriculture. The food that was produced in Jordan is spectacular. We know about some of the chemicals and the Dead Sea salts. These are things that are, you know, are known to foreigners like myself. But what did you see in the MIT and Harvard structure that came out and said, "Oh, I wasn't expecting that to be something that Jordan had a comparative
Actually, in
advantage
each
in."
sector, there are products that surprised us. And let me give you examples so that
Give
we're
us an
on
example.
the ground. So, like in the agricultural, and by the way, it's good and not services. This study talks about goods and not services. So when we go to the agricultural sector, I was surprised to see that dried fruits has a tremendous competitive advantage, and that we don't produce it, we don't export it, and exporting it actually adds to the sophistication of the export basket of Jordan. So it's a very simple kind of product. There is another product which we do not actually grow in Jordan, but we can grow, and it seems to be sophisticated somehow. And the sophistication is not in the manufacturing, but sophistication is in what we call the ubiquity, availability of the product worldwide. So we plant here lots of mint, na'na'. There is something which I didn't know. It's called mette, and it's in Arabic and English, by the way. And my son tells me it's being the in thing to drink, and it's like very much required all over. We can plant it here in Jordan. We can export it. It's people are paying lots of money for it. So these are like simple examples of what we can do on the machinery. Let's say on the more sophisticated side, like milking machinery is something that we do not do, but the study says we have the knowledge, the production knowledge on doing that. You mentioned the Dead Sea products. Dead Sea products, if you want to ask me what is the first number one product which we should be exporting more of, I would tell you Dead Sea products. For one simple reason, nowhere else in the world can export this product except for the Dead Sea and people around the Dead Sea. So the ubiquity of this product makes it sophisticated and makes the request for buying it, people are willing to pay so much money. So this is the type of sophistication. So it's not just sophistication of instruments and machinery, and this is what we try to highlight.
Well, I'm a great fan of Dead Sea products ever since I've been coming. I'm actually nearly 80 years old, but I've been using Dead Sea products since I came 5 years ago, and you can see I'm a living, breathing proof of how it works. Heike, I'm going to turn to you now. Now, just before you say anything, let's all be clear here. Heike, you're not the European Union. We're not asking you to speak on behalf of Europe, or you may choose, if you wish, to address the trade issues, but you don't anyway have to. And I'm fully aware that you're EBRD, not the European Commission or EU. So please give us your comments on what all the others have said.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much. And yes, so the name's a bit misleading in European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but we always say, so we're a global institution with a European heart.
Yeah.
So we have global shareholding. I mean, Jordan is a shareholder. US is our biggest shareholder with 10%. But I think we do have a sense that, given that 60% of our shareholders are European countries, we do have a European heart. And so I think, so I'm commenting a little bit on the export opportunities to Europe and the challenges of reaching those, but also the challenges of diversification and cost reduction that colleagues mentioned here. So I do think, yes, Europe can be, is definitely underutilized as an export destination for Jordanian products. The new rules of origin are one increment in supporting further exports to Europe. But as an institution that has membership in across all our European countries, Europe is a complicated market. Europe is a market that is not a homogeneous market, and Europe is a market that a lot of its neighbors want to reach. So I think you are not just competing with production within Europe, you're competing with textiles from Turkey, you're competing with outsourced automotive manufacturing from Ukraine. So there's a lot of competition in
financial services from the UK
financial
in
services
about 2
from
years'
the UK.
time.
So I think you need to understand exactly where your niche is and trying to be competitive in that niche, which is a very competitive. But I think I do believe in the growth potential. I think there's a lot of impatience surrounding. There's a new trade deal on the table. It's been implementing. And now we should see immediate jumps in growth rates of exports to Europe. I think this will take time.
Yep.
I do see a huge potential for exporting all the products that actually Hala was mentioning to Europe. However, I think this will take time. It will take time in terms of understanding the regulation better. I think also some of the sophisticated products like pharmaceutical products that Jordan already sells globally have a bigger potential in Europe than currently utilized. They have a great exposure in US markets, but I think there is more potential in Europe as well. I think one of the reasons also to be more competitive, not just in the European but global markets, is actually picking up two of the elements that colleagues have mentioned here on the podium. One is reduction of costs. I think Jordan has done tremendous strides in reducing electricity costs. I think energy costs were very high in Jordan. Using solar in particular, costs have come down tremendously, but I think there's huge potential for greater energy efficiency in production in Jordanian companies. I think this will make them more competitive globally, and I think this is a path that has started. I think there was the focus on creating more green energy generation, but now it's also how can we reduce electricity consumption in the production processes. So that's, I think, a big one for the years to come. And then I think also diversification is critical in terms of product space to adjacent products, using the value chain more successfully, but then also reducing costs in capital. And I mean, I'm glad that this actually gave EBRD a role in the country to producing, alongside with Jordanian banks, the full range of capital. Because what we see is also, I mean, yes, loans are one instrument that is needed in the economy, but one needs to really see the full range of financing instruments for certain sectors. And for example, where I do see a really big growth potential is equity capital for Jordanian companies, for startups, for ICT companies, but also for companies that are in a growth phase now. I think Jordan has done extremely well in the ICT revolution in getting a lot of the content Arabic speaking on the web, but I think then a number of these companies are stuck in finding growth capital. There are a couple of venture funds, very few private equity funds, and so companies that are in this sort of ICT space struggle in sort of growing globally now. So I think also reducing costs in the financial space and in the capital space and giving more access to a broader set of capital instruments will really be critical in reaching a different level and a different resilience for growth for Jordan.
How much, I mean, this is a specific question regarding the sort of venture and private equity type, how much of that is due to a lack of capital or actual legal regulatory barriers to the capital flowing in the way that it needs to? Like, I don't want to get too granular on it, but like limited partner, general partner structures, which help an investor manage risk and commit to these. And that's what you need if you're going to have private equity. You can't do it any other way.
Absolutely. I think that the general legal framework is in place.
Yeah.
So we see a number, so it is actually a lack of, but then I think beyond that it's a lack of attractiveness for this type of risk capital in the country, both in terms maybe from a tax perspective, but also in terms of just creating the necessary momentum and the necessary sort of ecosystem. So I think for an equity investor, it's always the choice between shall we go to Dubai and the Gulf, or shall we deploy our equity and risk capital in the Levant, say in Jordan. Yeah. And I think, of course, the challenges in the economics in the Gulf are helping now Jordan, and I think this is a moment that Jordan should seize and see, look, this is actually a great infrastructure here where you can deploy equity capital if you're maybe a bit more patient, but it actually has a lot of potential and has a regional reach. So if you're based in Jordan, deploy equity capital, you can deploy it through Jordan, in the Gulf, in the Levant. But I think this is also a critical moment because I think we've seen a lot of brain drain in the equity industry to the Gulf, and I think now is the moment. I mean, I see it just in EBRD, the applicants that we get from returnees from GCC countries. So I think for this sort of more equity-based industry, this is a moment to really attract talent back from the Gulf and sort of just to broaden the ecosystem. Because if you only have like one or two funds, then there's not enough visibility of the system for others to know about and come here. But I think this is something critical.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that makes it all work is a couple of profitable exits, and then everyone wants to do it.
Yes.
Okay, now, we've got 20 minutes left, so before I have that was the first question. I've got 10 other ones, so don't worry. Okay, Christos, come back and
I just want to comment on this point, because I also firmly believe the point that Haki is trying to make, that is making very well, that having more capital comes quite important. But I want to take it to the poll. When the poll in the beginning said, when you asked fiscal consolidation versus growth, and I'm thinking that it's really entirely possible that, my view is actually happening, that the large debt is also acting as a hindrance, maybe making investors think twice about whether they should come to Jordan. So the importance of the consolidation is not only to create the fiscal space, to invest, to do more capital investment, to support more communities, but also to give a little bit of reprieve, a little bit of a pause, and a little bit of confidence to investors that the debt is under control, the macroeconomic stability is consolidated, it's there. So it's really now about doing the business of growth, of investing, of development.
Yeah.
Not having this fundamental building block addressed, the issue of debt and consolidation, leaves a lot of questions around.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that the subtext of both the Minister of Finance and the Governor's statements this morning were that, look, we've got to sort out the foundations. We've got to keep macroeconomic stability. And as he said, he talked a lot about the debt being the major issue there, or the growth of the debt. And then the Governor said, we've got to keep the financial sector stable because, you're not going to get anything else if either of those two things are unstable. Only productive investment capital formation will only follow on the back or in a significant way, on the back of those two foundations. And I think that's fair to say. And I think the piece of the government position that we miss, or have missed, is the Minister of Planning, which is like, what are you going to do once you've got those two things solid? And of course, he will be here later on. So we'll ask him those questions. Now, I want to ask you if you have anything you would like to say or any questions you would like to ask before I move on. There's a lady at the back with her hand up. If you, Lauren there with the red on is going to bring you the microphone. Thank you. Oh, the microphone doesn't work.
Thank you very much to the panel, Electra Tsekalidu, EU delegation. So I have 3 comments to make and a question to ask to the panelists. So the first one is around the data that we heard earlier on the trade balance between Jordan and the EU. First, let me say that there are a few inconsistencies between the data that we have collected in Brussels. So for us, the trade balance is, of course, skewed in favor of imports from the EU to Jordan. However, the number of exports from Jordan to the EU has risen by 5.5% from 2016 to 2017 and has reached 357 million euros. In terms of that, it makes the EU the eighth market for Jordanian products. So that's in terms of the data. Then when it comes to the elements that could really create more opportunities, because these opportunities exist, indeed, there are 3 main areas that the EU and member states work very closely on. One is support to the private sector, small and medium enterprises, in terms of providing capacity building or some type of microfinancing options. And the EBRD is one of the financing and financial institutions that provide that, especially to women. The second one is supporting the strategy on financial inclusion, and that includes financial literacy, and that's something that's extremely important in order for Jordan to be able to diversify, not only to Europe, but across the world. And then the second one is around rethinking innovation and rethinking the linkages between so employment, education, and vocational training. It's true that there are things in terms of the private sector moving to higher segments of their value chains, and that's reducing costs and increasing efficiencies and reduction of price competitiveness, because as Heike mentioned very, very correctly, there is an element of competition to the European market that cannot be underestimated. And then the third pillar is the one of regulatory predictability, and this is something that Christos mentioned as well, and that is linked to obviously the fiscal consolidation, but also all the support that donors have been providing and the immense job that the government of Jordan has undertaken in terms of reforming all the investment climate, business regulation that's linked to business creation, and then the employment components. So concluding around that, something I didn't hear was labor market reform, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on the links between the labor market and revitalizing Jordan's growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for your intervention and for putting the side of the EU. Can I just give you one question? Just do you happen to have the numbers? You revised the numbers upwards for the imports from Jordan. That's fantastic. Is it inaccurate in the same way with the amount Jordan imports from the EU? What was your number two?
No, the number was correct.
That number was correct.
And in terms of the sectors that have been driving the growth in imports from Jordan to the EU, it's basically the sectors that have been identified in Jordan 2025 as high added value. So that's chemicals, that's manufacturing, and that's textile.
Right.
And we're talking a year-on-year growth of between 30 and 15%.
Fantastic. Well, let's hope next year we get better numbers. So let's talk about labour market reform. Hello. Off
The
you go.
numbers.
We're on a stand-up fight on numbers. Briefly,
I
please.
just want to explain something. There is a difference between Jordan's exports and re-exports. So there are some databases
Sure.
like the UN Comtrade and the Bachi data, which has exports of Jordan that are higher than what we call the domestic exports.
Yeah.
And we care about the domestic exports. We don't really care about these exports that come to Aqaba and then leave Aqaba. And so if you add the re-exports to the exports, you can come up with such numbers.
Okay. Well, fine. We're not going to continue on the statistics. Who wants to talk about labour markets? Radwan, why don't you say something about labour market reform? Do you think labour market reform is a priority? I'm going to start with you, Carol, because you're the local.
No, absolutely. But actually, this is an easy one because I think Christos has been keen to talk about it. He even alluded to it in his earlier.
Oh yeah, I know, but you must have.
So I think.
All right, if you want to, I don't say I didn't give you an opportunity to speak. Christos, do you want to talk about labour market reforms?
Sure, this is definitely a region where things come from the left and the right.
Exactly. Well, you're not
But
expecting them.
But I think there's, I want to say, I want to keep it a little bit general. We know, we have studies, many organizations have studies about rigidities in the labor market, differentiation between public and private sector, formal and informal.
Just speak a little
Sorry
bit.
about that.
That's much better.
Differentiation between public and private sector, formal and informal, and that has been studied quite a bit. But I think that the real issue is how to get labor costs relative to the countries that Jordan was trading to stop growing so fast, right? And it is not relative, and again, it's not relative to the past, it's relative to the markets Jordan wants to go in the future, and to having a sense of how far average labor costs could increase and keep Jordan competitive again. I think that is where I'm coming from. Now, there are opportunities to improve flexibility, so I know there are lots of discussions to support female participation in the labor force, which is a very large issue. Also, lots of discussions to support the inclusion of youth, so making it easier to hire young people in the labor force. The government has some programs. So I think all these things are very important. But I'm happy to come back, Richard, if you follow up. But I think that the thing to keep our eye on is relative to the product space Jordan wants to be, how can, and when it wants to reach those products, how can labor costs be competitive relative to those countries?
I mean,
I'll close with that, but
yeah. Well, I'll sort of just come back. Come back to all of you, and you can comment on this. You know, labour market reform is rather like efficiency savings. It's a euphemism for firing people. I mean, no labour market has ever been reformed by increasing the number of public sector employees. Jordan's got let's say, an unemployment rate of 17-18%. Unemployment is a major problem. We have seen in Western liberal democracies the problem that you get when you start focusing on cost efficiencies, is that you get a group of people that are chronically unemployed. That solution, that sort of neoliberal solution, that efficiency will trickle down and everything, is that model not, now a little bit discredited? And that I'm not saying that we should hire lots of people to do nothing, but we've got to look at a slightly different vector of approach. So Christos first, then Baker wants to.
I think the question in Jordan is, there's not only the unemployment rate is low, but labor force participation is also low, right? So the issue is how to expand the pie, how to expand the demand. And that's why the financial sector reforms are important. That's why the business deregulation or predictability is important. So it is about, I think the growth story in Jordan has to be about creating more demand. It's impossible to have a sustainable economy, an efficient economy, but one in which so many people are outside the labor force.
Yeah.
So I think thank you for clarifying that, but that is not the main issue. The issue has to be how to bring investment in through all these means that we're talking about.
Yeah, good. Okay, Baker. Are you being
Yeah,
very patient? Thank you.
No, not at all. So I want to bring in the private sector on this because I think one of the challenges is not just about the government reform side of things, but I think the lack of involvement of the private sector in identifying the skills needed and in sort of the training element of it. So I mean, we're working, for example, with all the tourism and hotels industry setting up a sector skills council, which is something that happens all across the world, where we're really the voice of the private sector, of what kind of skills are needed, what kind of trainings are needed, just giving a bigger voice and actually being heard in designing educational programs. So I think we see that a lack of private sector representation in these debates and discussions in Jordan, and this actually could help identifying specific training, specific projects. I'm not going to talk onto vocational training or the university, but just sort of building a skills base that is actually useful for the private sector to hire. Because as you said, I mean, no labor reform will ever lead to just more public sector jobs. Jordan needs to create jobs in the private sector, and so the labor force participation has to be in the private sector. So and it has to be through inputs of companies potentially hiring, and why are they not hiring, and what kind of skills are they looking for, and why don't university graduates have all those skills, and how can companies contribute through internships, through programs, to make sure that the graduates they get are the graduates they need. So I think I just want to make a sort of a point that the private sector needs to have a bigger role in designing these policies in Jordan to create and generate more private sector employment.
Okay. Thank you. That's a very good point. And interestingly, you touched on that whole. Well, I mean, that what you say is very true about Jordan, but it's true about lots of other places too. But particularly thinking of university graduates, I don't know what they're doing. Looking at my children, but anyway, never mind. Hannah, do you want to come in on this, because we've got 4 minutes left, and we've done one question and one question from the audience. So, so would you?
Do you want me to comment on?
Yeah,
the same?
I would like you to comment on the same thing so that we can have a bit of
Okay.
consistency.
The thing is, today we're seeing that private sector are mostly creating jobs here in Jordan. I think that the percentage is around 60% of the newly created jobs are created by the private sector, and we don't want the public sector to create more jobs because we know of the current spending and we don't want to increase that. Yet what we are seeing in the market is that there is this notion that people don't want to work, or there is the culture of shame, or women don't want to work. So for example, he mentioned economic participation, and if we look at the economic participation of women, I mean, it's shameful. I mean, the 83% of the women are economically inactive. So is it because women don't want to work? We don't think so. We think that we are not creating the jobs that the Jordanians are capable of and wanting to do. And if we look at the financial market, and so many of you here come from the financial market, the percentage of women working in the financial sector, I mean, is 35%, which tells you that women want to work, but the way they want to work, maybe in bigger organizations, maybe in more protective organizations, and 95% of our companies today are SMEs, and we have to admit that maybe women don't want to work in companies with 3-4 people in that company. So it's not just women. I'm just trying to say that the jobs we are creating do not match what's being demanded like by Jordanians. And therefore, let me go back to, there are two schools. Either we go to vocational training and try to train Jordanians for the jobs that are needed today in the market, or we can also create more sophisticated types of services and products that Jordan can do and able to do. Today we have 1 million expats, Jordanian expats, and we've been doing this survey, it's not done yet, but 82% of them, of these expats, have either a BA, MA, or a PhD. So highly educated. So we want to create the jobs that fit these people, and this does not contradict with the higher growth that we want to see in the economy, because this means that we need to create more jobs in more sophisticated services, in more sophisticated products, especially that we are heading everywhere towards the fourth revolution, fourth industrial revolution. So we have the capacity, we have the qualifications, but we need to create more services and start producing products that tackle that. And I am so happy today, one of the great companies, Petra, which we are very proud to be exporting its products all over the world. It's one of the sophisticated products that Jordan exports. If we were able to do it with Petra, then we are able to do it in many other products.
That's a lovely way. So Radwan, thank you, Hala. Radwan, we are now finished, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to say a few things before we finally
Give
stop.
me the... Just a couple of things. One is that I think one thing that we need on the domestic side of the economy is to reduce the cost of moving from informal activity to formal activity. As well as to reduce the cost for a small business to become medium, from a medium to become large. So this is just one remark that I like to make. A second remark, given the very limited time,
Thank you.
I think the question that is posed at the outset, which is, do you favor fiscal consolidation versus growth? I think is not appropriately put together, because I think both are needed. I mean, Christos has mentioned the confidence element of the confidence deterrent of high debt. So we definitely need to have fiscal consolidation, but the question is what type of fiscal consolidation? I think that's really the type of question we need to ask. I think for one thing, capital expenditure needs to be protected. It has not, I mean, more than it has been. Let's put it this way. Just to give you a sense, the share of capital to GDP, the correlation coefficient of that with the growth rate is 83%. And yet we see that the capital share of GDP has dropped since 2009. It used to be much more than 6%, now it's about 3.7%. Clearly, PPPs and private investment and all of that will make up for it, but it's not enough. So I think we need to move on both fronts, protecting capital expenditure and expanding the use of PPP. And then in that case, we would not have what may appear like a false dichotomy between fiscal consolidation and growth. We do not need to wait until we have full fiscal consolidation to have higher growth. I think we can work on both at the same time.
I wrote that question, and I wrote it deliberately. I am aware that, of course, you need both. I'm not trying to defend my question, but I deliberately put it there because I'm trying to get people's expression of what they feel, and so that's why we did it. We're not. We do understand that you need to do both. It's challenging. Please thank my panel, and please welcome Victoria and her panel.